On April 18, 2024, in the late afternoon, 17-year-old Murayama Runa from Rumoi in northwestern Hokkaido, Japan, was preparing to go out. She told her mother, "I'm going to meet a friend and will be back before 11 p.m." Wearing a loose hoodie, sneakers, and carrying a bag, Runa left the house. However, even after 11 p.m. came and went, she did not return. Worried, her mother called Runa's phone, only to find it switched off. Yet that was as far as her concern went at first. After Runa's parents divorced when she was in middle school, she lived alone with her mother. The somewhat unstable home environment made it difficult for Runa to settle down, and she sometimes ran away from home or skipped school. Her mother assumed that Runa had simply left and might be staying at a friend's place. Days passed, 1 day, 2 days, 4 days, and there was still no contact from Runa. Her phone remained off. Her mother finally contacted Runa's friends, but nobody knew where she was. At that moment, her mother realized something was truly wrong and rushed to file a missing person report with the police. On April 20th, the authorities began investigating. Typically, the first 24 hours after a disappearance are the critical, golden time, but in Runa's case, 4 days had already passed. The situation was urgent. Police analyzed CCTV footage and phone records to figure out where Runa might have gone. They discovered her last known movement in an unexpected place, a location called Kamui Kotan, on the outskirts of Asahikawa in Hokkaido, about 90 kilometers from her home, very far from Rumoi. Central Asahikawa is fairly well developed with shopping malls and restaurants, but Kamui Kotan in the outskirts is very different. People rarely go there, and there aren't many surveillance cameras. At night, the darkness is thick, leaving the area prone to criminal activity. Why would Runa have gone to such a place? The police deployed a search team in Kamui Kotan, checking CCTV and questioning local residents. Soon, a convenience store clerk emerged with a sighting of Runa. He recounted that on the late evening of April 18th, the store door flew open and she rushed in, gasping for breath. She was trembling, glancing around as though in fear. Then, in a shaky voice, she begged the clerk to help her. Alarmed, the clerk was about to call the police when another young woman, seemingly around Runa's age, barged in. She said firmly, "She's just acting strange. No need to bother with her," then grabbed Runa's arm and quickly led her outside. The clerk was stunned, and the two disappeared into the dark street. The police followed the CCTV trail from that side street and discovered a startling fact. 3 other young women and 1 man had also been with Runa. They seemed to be associates of the woman who had dragged Runa out of the store. Another witness stated that sometime between late night on April 18th and dawn on April 19th, Runa was seen standing precariously on the Shinkai Bridge over the Ishikari River in that area. This raised grim possibilities. There were fears that Runa might have encountered something at the river, resulting in her disappearance. Local residents explained that the Ishikari River is wide and has fast currents, making it a place where, if someone wanted to discard a body, it would be easy to do so. One resident noted that if an object was thrown into the river, it could become wedged between rocks and not resurface. Police took this extremely seriously and began an intensive search around the river. This continued for a full month with no progress, no remains, no possessions of Runa. With no leads, the police decided on a new angle. They analyzed seasonal factors and the river's flow. Hokkaido in April is early spring, so melting snow raises water levels, and there had also been heavy rainfall. Together, these factors caused an increased discharge of water, meaning anything in the river could have drifted quickly downstream. Shifting the search to downstream areas proved to be the right move. Finally, in late May, about 60 kilometers from the Shinkai Bridge, a body was discovered in the lower part of the river. Its face was unrecognizable and badly decomposed, making it impossible to identify by sight. After DNA analysis and fingerprint matching, the body was confirmed to be Runa. Alongside the remains, police recovered Runa's clothes and bag, but strangely, her wallet and phone were missing. The bag's zipper had been securely closed, suggesting the phone had been intentionally removed or disposed of separately, rather than simply being lost in the water. The autopsy showed that Runa had drowned. However, her entire body bore serious fractures and bruises, indicating she had been subjected to violence while still alive. Injuries consistent with a significant fall from height were also noted. It appeared she was beaten, then forced off a bridge. Detectives believed her phone might contain crucial evidence, records of who she met before she died, so they reached out to her phone carrier and social media platforms to access her data. Their investigation revealed something shocking in Runa's direct messages. She had been receiving ongoing threats. The messages read along the lines of, "Do you really want to end up like trash? If you don't want things to go badly, pay up now, 100,000 yen. The threatening direct messages stopped precisely on April 18th, the day she went missing. Tracing the account behind the threats led them to a 21-year-old woman named Uchida Riko. The police printed Riko's photo and showed it to the convenience store clerk who had seen Runa. The clerk immediately confirmed, yes, that's the woman who grabbed Runa and took her away that night. After weeks of investigation, the pieces began to align. On June 12th, about a month and a half after the incident, Riko was arrested on suspicion of murdering Runa. But Riko was not someone who would easily confess. Although Riko admitted meeting Runa, she vehemently denied the murder charges, insisting the accusation was being pinned on her unfairly. She acknowledged that she had taken Runa to a bridge and left her there, but claimed she had no idea whether Runa fell or went somewhere else. The police possessed records of Riko's threats in those direct messages, but did not initially have enough evidence to prove actual murder or assault. Riko refused to confess anything, so the investigation seemed stuck. Just then, fortune intervened in the form of new evidence related to the Ishikari River. It turned out there are two major bridges in that region: the Shinkai Bridge, where Runa's body was recovered downstream, and another one called the Kamui Bridge. By chance, Runa's damaged phone was discovered near the Kamui Bridge. A separate search was launched in that area, leading to the unexpected find. Police quickly performed digital forensics on the phone and recovered a chilling video. In the footage, Runa lay on the floor without her clothes, crying and pleading, repeatedly saying she was sorry and begging for mercy. The camera shook, and the voices of Riko and other perpetrators could be heard in the background, mocking her. Near the end of the video, Runa was seen trembling with fear as she was forced to sit on the bridge railing. The suspect, Riko, was heard shouting, "Fall, go die." This decisive piece of evidence exposed the truth behind Runa's death. This discovery revealed the full story of the crime. The main culprit was indeed Riko, but she was not alone. A group of young people took part. Among the accomplices were two minors aged 16, whose identities were withheld. However, one other suspect besides Riko, 19-year-old Konishi Yuka, did have her name made public by police. The case was considered so severe that revealing her identity was deemed necessary. It became the first time in Asahikawa that a minor suspect's identity was publicly released. How were these people connected to each other and to Runa? Initially, just a few months before, Riko and Runa had never even met. They lived far apart. Yet a single photo posted on social media triggered the tragedy. Runa was generally quiet, kind, and well-liked by her friends. However, the divorce of her parents had led her to move to a new city with her mother, and she struggled to adapt. Even after entering high school, things did not improve. Eventually, Runa quit school before completing her first year. Later, she enrolled in a distance learning high school, which mostly offers online classes. In reality, she was not attending school regularly and felt isolated. Seeking companionship, Runa turned to social media. She did not often post her own selfies or pictures of herself hanging out with friends. She had few such photos to begin with. Instead, she uploaded amusing memes or quotes she found online, hoping people might like them even if they didn't know her personally. Seeing reactions and comments on her posts became a small source of happiness. One day, Runa found a silly photo of someone eating ramen in a comical way. Thinking it would entertain others, she posted it on her account without much thought. Sure enough, the response was huge. People laughed, teased, and asked, "Who is that person?" Unfortunately, the individual in the photo happened to be Rico. She was extremely self-conscious about her face and body and hated unedited pictures of herself. She only ever posted heavily filtered images. Yet Runa had unknowingly shared an unfiltered photo of her, and it spread widely online like a meme. As hinted before, Rico was notorious, known as a delinquent during her school years. She got satisfaction from dominating those weaker than herself, was quick-tempered, and bullied those she disliked. Physical assault and extorting money were routine behaviors. That pattern only worsened once Rico became an adult, continuing to wreak havoc around the nightlife scene of Asahikawa. She drank heavily and was allegedly involved in trafficking banned substances. She built connections with dangerous people and led a reckless personal life, including forcing others into humiliating behaviors for her amusement. She had no proper job, but funded her partying by effectively coercing or borrowing money from people with no intention of repaying it. Those who knew her began avoiding her, so her funds dried up. Then she considered a new way of making easy money through intimidation and scoured social media like a predator seeking prey. Whenever she identified someone vulnerable, Rico scrutinized that person's posts and associates, seeking any secrets or weaknesses, such as illicit affairs or inappropriate behavior. She would use such dirt to threaten and blackmail her targets for money. It was despicable, but apparently effective. Then she discovered Runa, who had unknowingly posted Rico's unedited photo and made her a laughingstock. Anger boiled. Yet Rico also saw Runa as an easy mark. Rico first contacted her with furious messages. "How dare you post a picture of me without editing?" Runa, timid and apologetic, repeatedly said sorry. From that alone, Rico realized she had found someone she could easily dominate. Horrific threats followed. "Do you know who I am? I'm going to come after you." Vicious insults and menacing language poured out. 17-year-old Runa was terrified and eventually promised to pay Rico 100,000 yen, about 1,000 USD at the time, as a sort of peace offering. Runa was desperate to avoid physical harm to herself and possibly her mother. Yet, just as Runa tried to send the money, there was a technical banking error that delayed the transfer. Rico exploded in rage, hurling more threats. "You think you can trick me? You really want to pay the price?" Runa was too scared to sleep, imagining that Rico would hunt her down and hurt her or her mother. In a desperate move, Runa agreed to meet Rico in person, properly apologize, and hand over the money. On April 18th, they met near a station. Rico did not arrive alone. She brought along 3 accomplices. As soon as they saw Runa, they forced her into a car and drove toward Rico's turf in Asahikawa. Throughout the ride, Rico and her group verbally and physically abused Runa, even assaulting her in humiliating ways. Runa was trapped in the car for about 4 hours, subjected to torment. Eventually, they reached Asahikawa and stopped briefly at a convenience store. With everyone distracted, Runa managed a daring escape and ran inside to ask for help. But the attempt failed when Rico appeared, pulled Runa outside, and took her away once more. Furious that Runa had tried to flee, Rico dragged her into a dark side street and beat her nearly senseless. They put Runa back into the car and headed for the Shinkai Bridge. Rico, who was from that area, knew the spot was deserted and had no CCTV. However, once they arrived, they realized there were more passing cars than expected. Deciding it was too risky, they switched destinations. They traveled 3 kilometers to the Kamui Bridge. There, the group forced Runa out of the car and made her remove all her clothing. Realizing this was life-threatening, she pleaded desperately for them to spare her, but they laughed and kept filming. Shortly afterward, Rico forced her to sit on the edge of the bridge and ordered her to jump. By then, Runa had endured hours of beating, humiliation, and mental torment. Perhaps feeling that begging further was pointless, she threw herself from the bridge. After confirming that Runa was no longer visible, Rico grabbed her wallet and phone. Rico later threw the phone away near a different bridge, then she and the accomplices left the scene. Their cruelty was beyond measure. Subsequent disclosures revealed more details. Among Rico's accomplices, the 19-year-old named Yuka had not simply appeared on the day of the incident. She had been involved from the start, helping Rico send intimidating messages. The two seemed to be part of a delinquent network, like an older sister-younger sister relationship, enabling each other's crimes. Yuka had been a troublemaker since childhood, constantly bullying classmates and even verbally abusing teachers. Eventually, she fell in with the worst possible companion, Rico. Both continued their wild ways as adults, roaming bars and entertainment districts. Shockingly, just 3 days after they committed the crime, the two posted a carefree video on social media, singing happily as they went for a drive. Not only that, but records showed that they also partied with some unexpected individuals. Among them were officers from the Asahikawa police. Given Rico's love of flaunting power and connections, it seemed she deliberately maintained relationships with people in positions of influence, including certain law enforcement officers, by offering them whatever they wanted. It turned out that some of these same officers ended up assigned to Runa's missing person search. To make matters even worse, it was revealed that Rico was having an illicit relationship with one of the investigators on her own case, who held the rank of assistant inspector. When this news came to light, Hokkaido's police department had no choice but to discipline the officer, and public outrage grew over official corruption. Additionally, thanks to the revelations about Rico and Yuka, the systemic problems of corruption and unethical behavior in the local police were brought to the forefront. In June 2024, Rico and Yuka were indicted on charges including murder, forced indecency, confinement, and extortion. Their trial is still ongoing, and the case has drawn enormous attention in Japan. The more that surfaces about Rico's character, the more horrifying it becomes, and public opinion strongly demands the harshest penalty for both. There is intense curiosity about the final court decision. Finally, there is a coda. Observers wonder who might have shaped Rico and Yuka into what they became. Their surroundings, school, and society may share some responsibility. Both had been infamous for bullying as students. Why were they never disciplined more severely in school? Why does society not impose harsher consequences on those with a record of school violence to teach them the gravity of their actions? Although it might be impossible to change individuals who display inherently cruel behavior from birth, at the very least, adults and the community have a duty to step in before such traits evolve into even more sinister outcomes. We're moving on to the second story, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the first one in the comments. Around 11 p.m., a motorcycle pulled up in front of a block of flats in Tunbridge Wells, England. Two people dismounted, a 25-year-old woman named Wendy Nell and her boyfriend Ian. They had just returned from a delightful date and arrived at Wendy's home. She bid Ian farewell with a brief kiss and waved as the motorcycle vanished from sight. However, the next morning, Wendy failed to show up for work. Having only recently been hired, she couldn't afford to skip a day without notice. Her colleagues, alarmed by her absence, reached out to her boyfriend. A concerned Ian immediately made his way to her apartment. No matter how many times he rang the doorbell or knocked, there was no response. Stepping outside, he glanced up at her apartment windows and noticed one was wide open. Sensing something was amiss, Ian decided to climb onto the roof and descend through the open window. He managed to get inside. Wendy was home. She lay in bed, her head covered by a blanket. At first glance, she appeared to be in a deep sleep. Ian gently tried to wake her by stroking her head but felt no movement. In a panic, he opened her eyelids and instantly realized Wendy was no longer alive. After he called the police, the officers who arrived at the scene discovered evidence of a struggle on her body, particularly around her head. A detailed autopsy revealed that the cause of death was asphyxiation. Moreover, signs of sexual assault were evident. More horrifying was the suggestion that the assault likely occurred immediately following her death. The murder took place in the apartment of a young woman who lived alone. The police hunted the perpetrator for several weeks, but the investigation made little headway. Then, on November 24th, 5 months later, a similar crime occurred in the same area. Just 400 meters from the scene of the first crime, the body of 20-year-old Caroline Pierce was discovered. She too returned home by taxi at midnight, but the next day she failed to show up for her shift at the restaurant. Her friends stopped by her place, but she was nowhere to be found. This marked the moment when Caroline was officially declared missing. The night before this unsettling incident, a scream was heard, and it was no mere coincidence. Witnesses reported a woman's voice repeating something, followed by a 30-second scream. Despite these testimonies, the investigation stalled. Finally, after 3 long weeks, Caroline's body was discovered in a storm drain in a local park. Ironically, upon hearing about a woman murdered while alone in her own home, Caroline had immediately changed all the window locks. Her workplace was close to her home, yet she still chose to take a taxi back. Yet she couldn't escape the shadow of tragedy. These 2 young women shared several similarities. Both lived alone in one-room apartments. Both bore nearly identical head injuries, and both bodies were found unclothed, details that intertwined the 2 cases. The timing of the crimes was also eerily similar. Both occurred after 11 at night, in the dead of night. However, to assert that a single perpetrator was behind both crimes would be premature. Thus, the police began investigating each case separately, although they did not rule out the possibility of a serial killer. Delving into the details in Wendy's case, unidentified DNA was found at the crime scene. A plastic bag with blood-stained fingerprints was discovered near the bed. Marks, presumably left by the culprit, were visible on Wendy's blouse. In today's world, such evidence would be pivotal, but back then, when forensic science was in its infancy and databases were non-existent, these clues held little weight. It's worth noting that DNA profiling had been used in court for the first time just a year prior, in 1986. At that time, the capabilities were limited, and these pieces of evidence did not lead to the capture of the criminal. Thus, the murders of Wendy and Caroline remained unsolved, forever lost in the archives of cold cases. As time passed, as often happens, they faded from memory. Decades went by, and then, in December 2020, 33 years after the events, the British police dealing with cold cases made a startling announcement. Reports came in that a suspect had been arrested in connection with these mysterious murders. So, who is this individual? It turned out to be David Fuller, who was 66 years old at the time. He worked as an electrician at a hospital in Tunbridge Wells, not far from the scenes of the crimes. Colleagues who had worked alongside him for years remembered him as the quintessential gentleman. According to them, he was quiet, composed, and an extremely diligent worker. In his free time, Fuller was an avid cyclist. All in all, he seemed like an ordinary, unremarkable colleague. David Fuller is a person whose story demands a closer look. Over his lifetime, he had been married 3 times and was known to have 3 children. However, in contrast to the positive reviews from his colleagues, his neighbors in the area recalled him differently. They noted that David avoided making eye contact with them, as if he was afraid of locking eyes with anyone. Even in the height of summer, the blinds on his house windows remained shut, creating an aura of seclusion and even a somewhat sinister atmosphere. One neighbor recalled frequently hearing Fuller drive away in his car around 2 in the morning. This odd behavior suggested that he had something to hide, and his actions aroused suspicion. Meanwhile, over the past 33 years, DNA analysis technology in the UK had made significant advancements. This allowed for a re-examination of DNA samples taken from the scene of Wendy's murder. The analysis revealed 9 individuals with partial DNA matches. Among them, one stood out with a high level of similarity: David Fuller's biological brother. The likelihood of such a close DNA match, retained for over 30 years, is roughly 1 in a billion. It's an exceedingly rare occurrence. The police immediately reached out to Fuller's brother. However, it was discovered that at the time of the crime, he lived far from the crime scene and could not have been the perpetrator. Consequently, investigators shifted their focus to other relatives with similar genetic profiles, ultimately zeroing in on David Fuller, who lived nearby. Furthermore, bloody fingerprints found at the crime scene were a perfect match to those found on Wendy's bed. Traces on the blouse discovered at the crime scene also proved to be crucial evidence. During the initial investigation, it was discovered that the shoe sole belonged to a model of Clark's brand athletic sneakers. It might have seemed impossible to track down the perpetrator based on this footwear alone, but the police managed to obtain family photographs of Fuller. They meticulously examined each one, and there, in pictures from the 1980s, they found him wearing that very model of Clark's. This was truly a moment when the police's persistence paid off. Soon, the police stormed into David Fuller's house. They asked him, "Are you aware of the murders of Wendy and Caroline 33 years ago?" He vehemently denied any involvement and claimed to know nothing about it. However, as they began to search the house, shocking facts gradually emerged. In his study, the police discovered a massive collection of hard drives, CDs, and even old floppy disks. When they seized and analyzed them, they were stunned. They contained millions of photographs and videos of a sexual nature. Millions! But was it just pornography? No. All the materials were taken by Fuller himself. But when the police began to closely scrutinize the photographs, they were astounded. The women in the pictures did not appear to be alive. These were the bodies of the deceased. Furthermore, when they investigated where these images were taken, it became clear that they were all shot in the same location, in the morgue. In that cold place where bodies are stored, David Fuller had been committing his horrific crimes for years, creating a sort of collection of photographs and videos. This vile and sordid collection had been slowly growing over 12 years, starting from 2008. So, to summarize, David Fuller is indeed the killer of Wendy and Caroline. He murdered these two women in the late 80s and then hid from justice, living a quiet life. However, he could no longer suppress his twisted desires. At some point, he devised an even more clandestine and disgusting way to satisfy them, choosing the bodies of deceased women as his victims. Remember where he worked? At the Tunbridge Wells Hospital, David Fuller, an employee, possessed a security pass granting him unrestricted access throughout the facility. This privilege allowed him to enter the morgue even during the dead of night, when no one else was around. Particularly in the so-called pathology suite, where, out of respect for the deceased, surveillance cameras were notably absent. Fuller exploited these blind spots to carry out his inhumane crimes. A thorough examination of his movement records revealed that he frequented the morgue not only during his shifts, but also in the late hours. This matched the testimonies of witnesses and neighbors who reported seeing him leave his home at dawn. David Fuller harbored an almost pathological obsession with the bodies of the deceased. In the morgue where he was employed, numerous bodies were stored, and he meticulously gathered information on each one, utilizing logs and identification tags. Furthermore, he tracked down the deceased's profiles on Facebook and other social media platforms, continuing to collect data. To date, at least 102 bodies have been identified as victims. However, Fuller had been working at the hospital since 1999, 9 years prior to commencing his morbid collection in 2008. This suggests that the number of victims could be higher, and his crimes may have begun before 2008. How could someone be capable of such acts? The horrifying truth came to light during the investigation of 2 unsolved murder cases. Fuller confessed to not only these 2 murders, but also to 51 instances of desecrating bodies. Delving into how he committed the murders revealed that his first victim was Wendy, whom he had randomly encountered while she worked at a supermarket where he shopped. She became his target for no apparent reason. Following this, he set his sights on Caroline, who lived merely 400 meters away from him. Unlike Wendy, he had no prior acquaintance with Caroline. Regarding the charges of desecration, Fuller appeared indifferent, claiming he couldn't recall when he began or how many individuals were affected. He simply evaded answering. In December 2021, the court found David Fuller guilty of desecrating 1,029 bodies over 12 years, starting in 2008, and of the rape and murder of 2 women in the past. His sentence: 2 life imprisonments. Life means life, right? However, 1 life sentence turned out to be insufficient, so he received 2, plus an additional 12 years in prison. It was as if the court was telling him, don't even think about parole, rot in prison for the rest of your days. This sentence became the second harshest in British history at that time. Following the sentencing, he remains behind bars in a British prison. Before the criminal's identity was uncovered, the families of Wendy and Caroline had supported each other for over 30 years. They strived to shed light on the unjust deaths of 2 forgotten girls. For the victims' families, knowing that the murderer has been punished will never replace the loss and pain of losing their loved ones. However, the fact that the killer is permanently isolated and can no longer cause anyone suffering provides them with some measure of solace. And finally, there is yet another aspect that reveals the dual nature of David Fuller. In the very year he broke into the homes of 2 women, brutally murdered them, and satisfied his twisted instincts, he also celebrated his first wedding. Perhaps he believed his crime would remain unsolved forever. Indeed, it took 33 years to find the answer. The inability to catch the criminal in time may have emboldened him further, leading to other horrific incidents of desecration. This is why it is crucial to catch those responsible for unsolved crimes.